We had a sellout, but it seems like some people are yet to arrive, but we should get going because the hour is getting late. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2017 Bono Wiener Memorial Lecture, and it coincides with the 120th anniversary of the Bund. But before I say anything else, I just want to say it's Tommy Kalewski's birthday. So, and I should explain to guests here that Tommy Kalewski is much loved by all of us. She is our, well, how can we describe it? She is indescribable. She is the person who accompanies everyone at all our concerts and many other things besides. She's just a gorgeous person. So happy birthday, Tommy Kalewski. We'll do it later. We'll have a happy birthday later. Now, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and the Bund. I think those two territories kind of meet here, of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we're now meeting. One of the things that Julian is concerned with, or one of the cases he details in his new book, is a case concerning the stolen generation. And when we make this acknowledgement, we make it because we are here because they were here for so many thousands of years, and we came here and it was a brutal dispossession. Now we are beginning to wake up to what happened back there, and we acknowledge their prior custodianship of the land. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the men, women and children on Nauru and the courageous men on Manus Island. I think it's now 120 days or more since they've been holding their peaceful vigil. And this is a historic protest against a great injustice of 4.5 years of false imprisonment. And what do they want? It's summed up very simply by Behruz Bishani, the Kurdish Iranian journalist on Manus Island, who says this: all the conversations are driven by one thing. That's the conversations that are taking place in the camp amongst the men. And one thing only, and that is freedom. Only freedom. Those poor bastards want one thing, freedom, and we have denied it to them. And they are sick, hungry, desperate, determined, and courageous. This is an historic moment. What's going on now is an historic moment. Now, we are thrilled to have Julian Burnside to deliver this lecture. And before I introduce Julian, we have a tradition to say a few words about Bono in introducing the lecture. And Julian, I know you would have loved Bono. And Bono Wiener would have instinctively understood the desperation and spirit driving the resistance of the men on Manus Island. He was one of my great mentors. He was a mentor to many people sitting here tonight. My abiding memory of Bono is him just walking tall and proud. He walked tall, he walked proud through the streets of his city, or any city in the world that he visited. And he visited at least 70 countries. He set up a travel agency so he could travel the world and keep seeing his friends and go to new places. Many things can be said about Bono. Just a few biographical details and a few remarks. He was born in Lodge in 1920. He grew up in a close-knit family on the third-floor apartment of 28 Skolnia Street. He gained his popular name Bono in place of Simcha Binam at school because Bono is derived from the Latin meaning goodness. Bono's parents, Moshe and Roisa, were active members of the Bund, and they imbued Bono with a love of Yiddish culture within the context of Bund ideology. Now, Julian, this is the 120th anniversary of the Bund. It was formed in 1897 as part of overall revolutionary movements of those times, but by 1901, the Bund had settled on something that was specific and different, and that is that one, socialism was what counted, but democratic socialism counted just as much. So they had an instinctive, wariness about totalitarianism of the left or right. And secondly, they And they stated by 901 that at the heart of who we are is something universal, universal brotherhood and sisterhood, but also we have our own culture. And Yiddish is the language of the people, and we value that language and we want to nurture it. And I would say that the Bund were way ahead of their times because they understood what we call multiculturalism a long time ago, that a democratic society involves a pluralist and diverse society at its best. Now, Bono was active in the youth movement, Skip and Zukunft, and attended the Madam School, the Bund Madam School. He graduated from the Jewish trade school system as a metal worker with some knowledge of mechanical engineering. Bono and his older brother were very mischievous. There's lots of stories about their mischief when they were kids. But Bono displayed his skills as an orator and public speaker early, delivering impassioned speeches in the Skip Forum. And then his world was turned upside down when the Nazis invaded in September 1939. And he was incarcerated in the Lodge ghetto with his parents, his beloved aunt Clara, and a population of 200,000 Jewish inmates. Bono assumed a leadership role in the ghetto. The Bund set up soup kitchens, conducted sporting and cultural activities, political forums, created a youth collective on the ghetto border where the young men and women grew vegetables and engaged in study and discussion. Yiddish writer Chava Rosenfarb, who was in the Lodge ghetto as a teenage girl, wrote of Bono, Bunde's children and adolescents clung to him as if to a young father. They opened their hearts to him, sought his advice in family matters, put their trust in his words. In whatever they did, they felt his care, his compassion and devotion to them. During illegal meetings, they were inspired by his passion and enthusiasm. They felt the power of his personality. And one of the legendary tales about Bono, and I tell it because in the audience today we have Avram Goldberg, the wonderful Avram, who's now, I said, 91 or 92 years old, and they had a secret radio that they shared. Now Bono was a 6-footer, and Avram is a 5-footer, and they had half the radio each. And the radio, having an illegal radio, meant torture and death. And many were put to death because they had these illegal radios. But they would duck in, put it together in secret, and out of that radio came the outside world and hope. So that's one of many, many legendary stories about Bono Wiener. His father and mother died from illness and starvation in the ghetto, and his girlfriend, Franka Buchholzer, was transported to Auschwitz. Now, as a locksmith, Bono could have, he was useful. He was useful to the Nazis. He didn't have to go to Auschwitz, but he accompanied his beloved Aunt Clara to Auschwitz because of her fear. And when she perished, but Bono continued his activism in Auschwitz. He organised clandestine meetings with his comrades in his barrack. He once received 15 lashes for allegedly disobeying camp rules, and he was determined not to let out one cry. And at the end of it, the person who was whipping him admitted a grudging respect for him. And he also told me that the reason he survived Auschwitz, the main reason is because he would trade food for a bar of soap. He said, every night I washed myself. And through washing myself and keeping clean, I kept my humanity intact. And he was liberated from the Mauthausen concentration camp. He tried to rebuild with his comrades the Bund in post-war Poland, but once the communists came to power, and for other reasons, including the Kielce pogrom, they escaped. Now, Julian, there's a connection between you and I and the work you do and this story, because Cafe Scheherazade, which 45 downstairs nurtured as a play and took it on from beginning right through to the end, and I have Julian, and we have Julian to thank for that. Avram Jeleznikov, who was the proprietor of that cafe, Bono's brother Pincher, Randall Kahn, who became a professor of economics in Chicago, and his wife, they escaped together. So that escape that's described from Poland was with those 5 people. So Bono and Avram were comrades back then. Now, Bono and his brother Pincher arrived in Australia in 1950, worked for a year as contract labourers in the Australian bush and on the railways out of Perth and Adelaide. They came to Melbourne and they flourished. They loved Australia and its knockabout ways. He became a builder of institutions, a Bund leader in Melbourne, the president of the Kadima Cultural Centre, benefactor of the Jewish Welfare Society, co-founder of the Shalom Aleichem College, co-founder and occasional president of the Holocaust Centre. I mean, the list goes on and on. But another point of contact is that Julian, your very close friend, Barry Jones, was very close to Bono. And Barry loved Bono. And Bono also was a member, in some ways a notorious member of the ALP. And they used to go out and late at night during election times and put up placards, ALP placards. It was Rosemary, Barry and Bono putting up placards. And what was interesting about this is the parallel with the fact that in the Lodge ghetto, Bono used to go out and put up placards about various actions. So he continued in his own fearless and fierce way. He would go down to the Yarra Banks where the fascists used to stand on their soapboxes, and he said there's only one way to deal with fascists. And for him it was like, bang, I've had enough of this. This is the way to deal with them. Now his zest and playfulness, his love of life drew people to him, and we loved him. We loved him as kids, we loved him as we grew older. And my most memorable memory of Bono is this. On his 50th birthday in 1970, I was fortunate to be in New York, sitting in a room in the Bronx, and there was a circle, right? And in this, I was the youngest by over 25 years. And we were sitting in a circle, and they went around the circle, and each one had to tell a story about Bono. And every single person had a story of how he either saved their life or helped them in dark times. And then it came to me, and I just said, I know I'm one of those fortunate to know him, to inherit his fierce love of humanity and human rights, and his wariness about totalitarianism. We gathered by his open grave in 1995, many of us who love Bono, friends from all walks of life, and farewelled him with the song that was sung at the funerals of Bund heroes. Is gefallen a dam, which means an oak has fallen, a fully grown oak with a head higher than those around it. So we honour his memory in many ways, and one of them is with this memorial lecture. So, introducing Julian, you're the perfect choice to deliver this 120th Bund anniversary lecture. Like Bono, it would take a long time to do your bio justice. Just a glimpse, a barrister based in Melbourne, joined the bar in 1976, took silk in 1989, has specialised at the bar in commercial litigation and human rights. The list of cases is so long, and some of the main cases are dealt with in Julian's new book, Watching Out. He's the author of children's book, Matilda and the Dragon, a number of books including Word Watching, Field Notes from an Amateur Philologist, Watching Brief, and now this extraordinary new book, which covers such a wide range of cases that Julian has dealt with within the context of human rights and the broader issue of a Bill of Rights and how the marginalised are dispossessed. Julian and his wife Kate, like Bono, practice what they preach. They set up spare rooms for refugees. We used to have many meetings at Julian's place. Back in 2002, 2003, he hosted countless meetings when there was a movement to release children from detention. And his house has been an open house in that respect for many, many people. He's an active patron of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, A Just Australia and Dying with Dignity. I am very fortunate to count Julian as one of my friends. Julian always says yes. I once asked him to launch a CD, the Fig Tree CD, and Julian said, I can't do it because I've got something else at the same time. So I said to him, well, my mum used to say you can't dance at two weddings with one bum. A famous Yiddish saying, and Julian said, I'm going to prove you wrong. And he turned up and launched it. So your generosity, I think, is a wonderful thing. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Julian to deliver the 2017 Bono Wiener Memorial Lecture on the topic, Justice at the Margins.
Can I start by thanking Arnold for such a generous introduction? Can we have a copy of it? I'll give it to everyone. When Arnold asked me to come and do this talk tonight, he gave me a copy of a piece which he'd written, I think, for The Age, about Bono Wiener, and it's a very moving account, and you can understand why. It's difficult reading that account and hearing the introduction tonight. It's difficult to understand how Bono Wiener managed to survive the Lodge Ghetto and Auschwitz and Mauthausen, but survive he did. And I wanted to read you two things, a brief fragment of Arnold's account, and then something that sprang to mind when I read it. He said, Bono continued his activism in Auschwitz, organising clandestine meetings with Bund comrades in his barrack. He received 15 lashes, you heard that, to his buttocks for allegedly disobeying camp rules. In an act of defiance, he did not moan but counted out each blow aloud, gaining the grudging admiration of the guard who whipped him. He once told me he had survived Auschwitz because no matter what the circumstances, even on freezing winter nights, after a day of relentless slave labour, he always washed himself, always clung to his humanity. And that reminded me of Primo Levi's wonderful book, If This Is a Man, where he talks about his time in Auschwitz and his friend Lorenzo, who was in Auschwitz with him. And Levi writes in that book that Lorenzo constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. Now, both of those stories have a lot in common because they remind us that being able to recognise the humanity of every individual is something which makes even the worst things worth surviving. Now, in Australia, we have had no equivalent of the Holocaust. Some members of the Indigenous community might deny that, but as a matter of scale, we've never had anything equivalent to the Holocaust. And to be honest, it's not possible to think of justice as a relevant concept in relation to things like the Holocaust. I mean, justice is something on a different domain. But how we treat people at the margins is profoundly important because it tells us something about the society we live in. And if we can think that justice for those at the margins is significant, and if we can genuinely believe it, then events like the Holocaust are much less likely to occur. Now, as I say, ideas of justice in relation to the treatment of Jews and gypsies and homosexuals in Nazi Germany are difficult to understand. The treatment of Jews throughout history doesn't come under the same domain as notions of justice. The treatment of Muslims since the Crusades, again, it stands outside the domain on which justice is relevant. Many Australians, including, I have to say, most lawyers, think that we live in a just society. That's something which I think many people disagree with, and I can understand why. Take, for instance, that area of activity, which, sort of by accident, I'm perhaps best known for, maybe only known for, the treatment of refugees. That was an accident, actually. It's Kate's fault. Because when the Tampa episode happened, I was asked by someone if I would appear pro bono for the people who'd been rescued by the Tampa. And I said yes, not because I knew anything about refugees, not because I knew anything about maritime law, I knew nothing about those things. But I do feel the heat. And here are these people sweltering on the steel deck of a ship in the tropical sun near the equator. And I could immediately see how awful that must be, and so I agreed to act on their behalf. People who had no prospect of getting help from any other quarter because they're Hazaras from Afghanistan stuck on the steel decks of a ship in the tropical sun. And by virtue of, Kate actually said, look, this is not the way Australia is. The Australians are hospitable. She then said, all Australian houses have a spare room, we should set up spare rooms for refugees. That's the way artists think. And I said to her, well, we better lead by example if we're going to encourage other people to accommodate refugees. And as a result of that, ever since the late 2001, we've had refugees living at home with us. But she also kept urging me on to take part in refugee, or the whole movement designed to achieve justice for refugees, or just treatment for them, and that's why I blame her for it. The way Australia treats refugees, specifically refugees who've come here by boat, the ones who had the initiative and the courage to make a break for it and try and get to a place of safety, the way we treat them is scandalous, and of course we've been criticised roundly by the United Nations and many other international as well as local NGOs. But there's a couple of special low points that you probably need to be aware of, because let's face it, boat people exist at the margins of our society, at the margins of Australian conscience. There was in the Migration Act, there's a provision which says that if a person is a non-citizen who doesn't have a visa, then they must be detained until they get a visa or until they're removed from Australia. Pretty simple, that's the indefinite detention provision. So there's a bloke who'd come to Australia as a boat person. He was knocked back in his initial claim for protection as a refugee. He could have appealed, he probably would have succeeded on appeal, but it would have meant another 5 or 6 months in a detention centre. I think he was in Woomera. And he couldn't bear it there. At that point, Woomera was holding about 3 times as many people as it was designed to hold. So on any view, it was a pretty uncomfortable place to be. He couldn't stand it. He said, look, just remove me from the country. I'll sign any document you like to facilitate my removal. But they couldn't remove him because he's a stateless Palestinian. So the Howard government argued all the way to the High Court of Australia that that man, innocent of any offence, they're not illegal, don't fall for that one, innocent of any offence, not suspected as a risk to anyone, he could stay in detention for the rest of his life. Think about that. A government in a modern democratic society in a time of peace argues for the right to hold a person in detention for the rest of his life, even though he's committed no offence and is not a risk to anyone. I'm sorry to say that by a majority of 4 to 3, the High Court ruled that that's what the Act means, and with that meaning it's constitutionally valid. Set that alongside an English case that was decided a couple of years later. England, the country which gave us our birth, the country from which we derive our morals, our principles, our ethics, our laws, our approach to laws. There was I think it was after the July 7 bombing in London, the English Parliament passed an act which said that if a person was a refugee, so in brackets couldn't be removed from the country, and if that person is a suspected terrorist, they could be detained without charge for up to 12 months. Now, and they said this was to preserve the life of the nation. That was an important get-out because in England they have at the moment a Human Rights Act which reflects the provisions of the European Charter of Human Rights. It's a function, it's a requirement of membership of the EU that you have domestic legislation that mirrors the Human Rights Charter. Now, there's a get-out, which is that you can step around the provisions of the Human Rights Act if it's necessary in order to preserve the life of the nation. So, we have the possibility of detaining a person without charge for up to 12 months, not for the rest of their life, for up to 12 months, to preserve the life of the nation. The case goes to the House of Lords. Is this valid? 8 to 1, the Law Lord said no, it is not valid. And Lord Hoffman, who was one of the conservative Law Lords, finished his speech by saying that the life of the nation is less threatened by terrorism than by laws like these. That stands at odds with the decision in Alcatel in the High Court of Australia. And I would say that Australia is less threatened by terrorism than by a law which allows innocent people to be jailed for the rest of their life. But that's just a personal opinion. Then, of course, we've got Nauru and Manus. Nauru and Manus were set up as a place for offshore processing during the course of the Tampa litigation. The Tampa litigation is important in a couple of respects. First, it was the trigger point at which our approach to refugees shifted significantly. And it shifted, as we now know, because John Howard was trying to win back some Liberal voters who had drifted across to One Nation. What it did, in effect, was to draw the Liberal Party closer to One Nation, but that was not the purpose. Anyway, the second thing that matters about the Tampa litigation is the timing. The Pacific Solution, so-called, was put together during the Tampa litigation, and the decision of Justice North in the Federal Court in the Tampa case was handed down at 2:15 in the afternoon, Melbourne time, on the 11th of September 2001. 8 or 9 hours later, the attack on America happened, and all of a sudden, boat people are illegals, and pushing them away was border protection. Bits of political dishonesty which have been extraordinarily toxic in their effect. Now, Manus, which is part of Papua New Guinea, and Nauru were the two places willing to accept money in order to warehouse refugees that Australia didn't want. And just as a matter of interest, I don't know if any of you in this theatre ever been to Nauru. Nauru is 2 square kilometres smaller than Tullamarine Airport. Okay? This is the place which we can throw all our unwanted refugees onto. But Manus is a place of very serious nastiness. I had a meeting in my chambers 15 or 18 months ago of people who'd worked in the health section of the operations on Manus. International Health and Medical Services, IHMS, run the health system for the refugees. Well, they did until they stopped providing medication recently. And anyway, so I had a meeting of people who worked in the health service in the detention centre on Manus. And I also had, incidentally, a senior Labor parliamentarian who's been a friend of mine since before he went into Parliament. One of the doctors really captured people's attention because this guy is not a bleeding heart. He has spent his professional career working in the prison system in Australia, and he decided to do some time on Manus because the pay was good. Okay, so there's no humanitarian instinct, whatever, apart from the fact he's a doctor. And he said a few things that really caught people's attention. First, that when he first got to the compound of Manus, his immediate inner reaction was, this is what the concentration camps must have been like. Second, after a week working inside, he formed the view that the conditions they were held in and the way they were treated was 100 times worse than he'd seen in any Australian prison. So innocent people are being treated 100 times worse than people convicted of serious offences and held in maximum security jails. And third, by the time he finished his tour of duty, he came to the conclusion that the barely concealed point of the exercise was to break their spirit so they would abandon their claims for protection and return to the country that they had fled. That's the way we deal with people who seek refugee status. And by the way, incidentally, it's worth noticing that while boat people have been the focus of political hatred since 2001, in almost every year since then, the number of boat people has been overshadowed by the number of people arriving by aeroplane with a visa for tourism, business, study, whatever, who then, after clearing passport control, who then apply for refugee status. Most of them turn out not to be refugees. Fewer than 50% turn out not to be refugees, but they're not vilified. We don't even notice that they've come here. They're allowed to live in the community. When their refugee claim is finally decided against them, they're removed from the country. It's all without fuss. But if you come by boat because you can't get a visa to come here, you are treated as if you are a criminal and you're called illegal, and that despite the fact that more than 90% of them are ultimately assessed as genuine refugees, legally entitled to be protected. It seems that in Australia we need to have some group that we can pick on mercilessly, and that's them. The interesting aftermath of that little episode with the doctor who worked on Manus was that the meeting broke up, but the parliamentarian remained behind and just catch up on news. And he said, and I believe him, that he was horrified to hear the things that doctor had said. He said, and I believe him, that he'd never heard facts like that about Manus. And then, without missing a beat, he said, mind you, it would be political suicide for Labor to take a soft line on boats. And there, I think in a single sentence, is the problem, the ethical problem in this country. You can see people of goodwill who recognise how wrong it is, the way we treat people at the margins, and yet for political reasons, they will do nothing about it. The other group, well, one other group who exist at the margins are the Indigenous people of this country, who are really treated as if they do not matter. People who, as Arnold pointed out in his introduction, were the traditional custodians of this land, people who've occupied this country for 50, 60,000 years, vastly older than Egyptian society or any European society, and yet they managed this land perfectly well for tens of thousands of years until we came and took it over. We damaged them by taking their land from them because we know now that the connection between Aboriginal people and the land is even more intense than the connection between parent and child. But if it wasn't bad enough that we took their land and caused them great damage, we then took their children and caused them even more damage. And the tragedy of the condition of Aboriginal people in this country is that we regard them as absolute losers, worthless people. No one seems to be doing anything constructive to repair the damage which we did. And frankly, if we're going to repair the damage we did, it's going to take a generation, because the damage done to one generation echoes to the next. But what do the politicians do? Token efforts and with an eye to the next election, and nothing better than that. It will take a generation. The reason I have that view is because of another case that is worth mentioning, a bloke called Bruce Trevorrow. Bruce Trevorrow was born to Aboriginal parents in November 1956. I mention that because I remember November 1956. I was a schoolboy in short pants in November 1956. And Bruce and his family lived at a place called 1 Mile Camp Menengi. Menengi is a very, very small town on the Coorong in South Australia. 1 Mile Camp was 1 mile outside Menengi. It was a collection of humpies made out of flattened out oil drums, old sacking and so on. The reason it was 1 mile outside Menengi was that in 1956, in South Australia, it was unlawful for Aborigines to live closer than 1 mile to a place of white settlement unless they had a permit. Bruce's family didn't have a permit, so they lived at 1 Mile Camp. Now, when Bruce was 13 months old, on Christmas Day of 1957, he got very sick. He was taken up to the Children's Hospital in Adelaide, about an hour's drive away. The records of the hospital still survive, and they show that he was diagnosed as having gastroenteritis. There was a wave of that going through South Australia at the time, and he was treated appropriately, and a week later he was better. And a week after that, he was given away to a white family who lived in suburban Adelaide. Now, as it happens, the white family had a daughter who was 16 at the time, and she came and gave evidence during Bruce's case as a woman in late middle age. She said that her mother had always wanted a second daughter. They saw an ad in the local newspaper offering Aboriginal babies, and so they went to the hospital. Instead of going looking at display homes, they went to a hospital and they saw a lineup of Aboriginal babies. They saw a cute little girl at the end of one line, so they said, we'll take her. She was handed over to them. They took her home, and when they changed her nappy, they discovered she was a boy. That's how casual it was for Bruce to be handed over. A little while later, his mother, Thora, down at 1 Mile Camp Meningie, managed to find a piece of paper and an envelope and a pen and, more difficult, an address. And she wrote to the Aborigines Department, the letter still survives. And she said, how's my boy Bruce going? I haven't forgotten that I've got a boy in there. When can he come home? And they wrote back a letter which still survives, which said, he's doing quite well, but the doctors say he's not well enough to come home yet. They had already given him away. The department later wrote a letter, the head of the department later wrote a letter to his counterpart in Queensland, saying, it's very inconvenient that we don't have legal power to take Aboriginal children from their parents. But between you and me, we do it whenever we get the chance. That was written, I think, in the late 50s, that letter. So, Bruce had all sorts of difficulties when he was growing up. The next hospital record of him was when he was 3 years old. He was admitted to the Children's Hospital in Adelaide because he was pulling his own hair out. He next came to attention of the authorities when he was 9. He was taken to the Child Guidance Clinic in Adelaide. They reported that he seemed to have no sense of who he was or where he belonged. When he was 10, the law had changed, and the authorities could no longer prevent his mother, Thora, from finding out where he was. And so he met Thora, his mother, for the very first time on his 10th birthday. And there's a photograph of their meeting. There he is in short pants and a little bow tie, and there's his mother, Thora, looking very much like an Aboriginal woman of the time who's come up to Adelaide from Victor Harbour, where she was living. He never met his father because his father had died 18 months or so before. Anyway, the meeting was interesting to both of them, and it was arranged that he would go down to Victor Harbour to spend the following Easter with his natural family. A lady from the Aborigines Department came round to Bruce's house in suburban Adelaide and put him on the bus to go to Victor Harbour, and after the bus had left, the foster mother said, he's too much trouble, I don't want him back. So the department posted his toys and his books after him. That's the way he was reunited with what remained of his original family. Didn't work out very well, he found it too difficult adjusting, and one night when he was, I think, 11 years old, he tried to walk from Victor Harbour back to his house in suburban Adelaide. He was picked up by the police and spent the rest of his childhood in state care. When he left state care, he was an alcoholic. His favourite drink was methylated spirits cut with orange juice. He had a life then which was pretty much characteristic of young Aboriginal men who've had a difficult upbringing. He had occasional spells of unemployment. He had occasional brushes with the law. He spent a couple of spells in jail. And every time he got in trouble with the law, he'd be sent off for a psych report. Every psych report ever given him said that he seemed to have no idea of who he was or where he belonged. Now, when Bruce was in his early 40s, he came across the Aboriginal legal rights movement in King William Street, Adelaide, and they embraced him because they had wanted to bring a stolen generation case. And while they had several changes of counsel shortly before the trial, they asked me if I'd appear for him, and so I did, and he ultimately succeeded in his case and remains the only Aboriginal person to have been found to have been unlawfully taken from his parents and to have suffered damage and to receive compensation for the damage he suffered. Now, why do I tell you this long story? First of all, because I think it's something we all need to understand, the way Aboriginal children were taken and the damage they suffered as a result. But more to the point, why do we need a long-term solution? Well, Bruce was, he's quite a nice guy, but he was a terrible husband and a terrible father. He couldn't relate to anyone older than about 18 months or 2 years because his development seemed to have stopped at about the time he was removed from his parents. His children have been damaged by his incapacity as a parent, and they will probably pass some of that damage on to their children when they have families. If we think that the damage we did by taking this land from the traditional owners and then taking the children from them, if we think that can be fixed by sending them some tractors during the course of one electoral cycle, we are deluded. We caused all sorts of trouble for them, they are damaged, they live at the margins, and we owe it to them to try and repair the damage that we caused. But it will take a long time. Unfortunately, no Australian government is interested in understanding that simple fact. I did want to say a little bit about the concept of justice. It's a very subtle and difficult idea, and Arnold and I have discussed this previously. I think most people have an instinct for justice, even if we can't immediately identify what is or is not justice. What it is hard to identify, but we can all recognise the favour of justice instinctively. The source of my own instinct for justice comes from strange circumstances in my childhood where my parents had separated. I'm talking early 1960s, so it was deeply unfashionable, and things were difficult for Mum, and so there were some fairly strict rules around the house, and I was a goody-goody, so I always stuck to the rules. My brother was a tearaway, but with a cheerful disposition, and he never stuck to the rules. But he didn't seem to get in much trouble on account of that. And it all came to a head in what, in my mind, I characterise as the Cutty Sark incident. Some of you will have heard of the Cutty Sark, a fantastic wool clipper from the 19th century, 3-masted sailing ship, beautiful, and like all goody-goody kids back then, and I'm talking in the 60s, I used to make model aeroplanes and model ships, and I was very, very conscientious. So I made the Cutty Sark, and it was a fantastic model, and I remember it had about 40 feet of string as the rigging, so you can imagine it took a long time to make. So one day I come home and I discovered that my cheerful, free-spirited, rule-breaking younger brother had been playing a war game with the Cutty Sark on the compost heap and had burnt it to the waterline. And I was outraged. I was absolutely furious. And he didn't get in any trouble. And I thought this was terrible. It took a long time to find out why he didn't get in any trouble. But it made me think this is profoundly unjust. Here am I, all the time, conscientiously following the rules, and here is Ian breaking the rules and not getting any consequences for it. It was years later that I learned the truth. When Ian was 9, he had one very, very hot summer holiday. He had what we were told was appendicitis, and he had a very impressive scar in consequence. But when Ian was 20, he was down at Geelong, and he broke another rule. Mum had a very strict rule: you don't hitchhike. Ian couldn't be bothered waiting for the train, so he hitched a lift home. But the driver was hopeless and ran off the road on a curve. The car ended up in a creek. Ian was knocked unconscious on the door pillar and drowned in the creek while the driver walked away unscratched. And it was in the wake of that that Mum told my sister and me that Ian hadn't had appendicitis. He'd had a rare form of cancer, of which at the time only 8 cases were known. 4 of them had survived to puberty and 4 had not. Now, if I had known that, then what seemed at the time to be unjust wouldn't have seemed unjust at all. It would have made perfect sense. It's it's an illustration of just how subtle the idea of justice can be. A little different understanding of circumstances would have changed my response, and I probably wouldn't be here tonight. But there's another interesting test of justice, and it's this, and I want you all to think about this. It's a thought experiment. Okay, imagine it's the last day of the school holidays. It's hot like today has been. Mum's at the end of her tether. The kids have been dreadful all day. She's making dinner. People recognise this pattern. She's in the kitchen making dinner, and she hears a crash in the sitting room. She rushes into the sitting room. The kids have gone, but her most valuable, most treasured vase is smashed to bits on the hearth. Now, here we go in two different directions. First, she just knows it's the young boy who did it, goes, finds him, punishes him, sends him to bed without dinner. As it happens, he was responsible for it. Second, she goes to each of them in turn, asks them neutral questions calculated to work out what happened, puts it all together dispassionately, comes to the conclusion that it's the young boy who did it, finds him, punishes him, sends him to bed without dinner. As it happens, he didn't do it. Which of those is closer to your impression of justice? Can anyone answer quickly? Which of those is more just? No, of course not. The second one, yes, the wrong result is more just. That's the problem. But it's the process. We know that the process matters. And will allow for a wrong result, even provided the process is okay. Then, consider this. You're a person with a small business. You've been ripped off by a supplier. You've got a perfectly good claim against the supplier for $5,000 because that's what you've lost. You go and see a couple of solicitors. They all say you've got to put $10,000 into the trust account before we'll even look at your case. And you think, putting up 10 to get 5, probably not a good bet, so you're not willing. You decide to act for yourself. So you go along to the court. The other side are heavily represented. They don't care how much they spend defending the claim. They have got a leading silk, they've got a team of juniors and solicitors, the whole thing. And they pull every procedural stunt in the book. And every time you go to court, because they've got a procedural motion to make, it costs you time and it costs you money if they get an order for cost against you. That's where good process is going to lead to injustice, because you will not be able to defeat them. And it's a terrible injustice when people like that find themselves incapable of achieving what they would see as a just outcome, because the just outcome is they get their $5 grand, probably. It's a very difficult problem, and to be honest, the people at the margins who I had in mind initially when Arnold suggested this as a topic, the people at the margins I had in mind were first of all boat people, because it's very, very plain that they get treated very badly, but they're a very small group. And the other group were the people who cannot afford law, and if they can't afford law, they can't get access to the justice system, because the law is the gateway to the justice system. And as a famous English judge once said, the doors of the courts are open to everyone, like the doors of the Savoy Hotel. Now, if you can't afford lawyers, then justice is virtually unachievable. If you decide to appear for yourself as a self-represented litigant, you might or might not get the right result. Judges try very hard to equalise the playing field. But even if you get the result you're entitled to, you won't have understood anything that's gone on, and you'll walk away feeling somehow that the justice system doesn't work. These are people at the margins. Why? Because legal aid is grossly inadequate. Parliamentarians are very enthusiastic about legal aid at election time. Access to justice is one of the mantras that they love. Funding access to justice is something they don't love. We have an unfortunate problem with the legal aid system, and I say this with no self-interest, because when I charge for the work I do, I charge rates which are higher than legal aid is willing to pay. So, you know, if legal aid funding is improved, it means nothing to me except an improvement in justice. the legal aid system now is so poorly funded that legal aid is only available to people who are defending quite serious criminal charges or some occasional family court cases. It is legal aid availability is trimmed to meet the budget. The budget needs to be expanded to meet the need. That's really, really obvious. If you think access to justice matters, then legal aid funding needs to be improved. Equally, funding of community legal centres ought to be improved substantially. Community legal centres represent a remarkable good value for the community. I worked out a while ago that if you look at the number of cases community legal centres deal with, and if you work out how much government money goes in to make that available, it works out at about $170 per consultation. Try getting a consultation with a decent lawyer for $170. You'll get 5 minutes in and out. But there's another group at the moment, and those are people who are right off the edge. People who are at the very bottom of the social and economic pile. And my attention to this was drawn by Tim Costello in a conversation I had with him. He told me about a time when he was running the Baptist church in Collins Street. Now that's a place where a lot of people just who are living rough turn up, get a free feed, say good day to a few people they know and so on. So he's telling me about this conversation he had with a bloke who apparently had been sleeping rough for a couple of years. And the guy said to Tim, that conversation he was having then and there was the first time in 2 weeks that he had had eye contact with another human being. That's a horrifying thought. I mean, that's someone who has disappeared in his own mind. That truly is being at the margins. And that sense of alienation, that sense of hopelessness, is something which I think it's incumbent on all of us to be aware that those people exist and to do what we can to alleviate the consequence of their circumstances. Not long after Tim told me that story, actually, I decided when he told me that I would make a point of not avoiding eye contact with people who are sitting on the streets and living rough, obviously, and sometimes they've got the cap on the pavement and so on. And I used to walk from Chambers up to the Victoria Market in the early mornings, a couple of days a week, to get supplies. So I'm walking up to the Victoria Market along Elizabeth Street, and I saw a bloke who was sitting there on the pavement. He's clearly got a cap on the ground. He's clearly wanting money. And I decided, remembering Tim's story, I would look him in the eye. And I looked him in the eye, and he smiled, and he seemed like an interesting sort of character. And I pulled my wallet out. And I pulled out what turned out to be the only note in my wallet, which was a 50. And he saw it. And I saw that he saw it. And he saw that I saw that he saw it. And I was really in trouble, so I gave it to him and said, "Oh, it's your lucky day." And maybe he wasn't at the margins for the rest of that day. I hope he went down the pub and had a beer. In any event, the Tim Costello story was also useful in 2 phases of what happened subsequently. First of all, thanks to Kate, I find myself heavily involved in the refugee thing, and as a result of being involved in the refugee thing, I get, first of all, death threats, and second of all, hate mail. Now, I thought the hate mail was interesting because I thought, well, I better answer it all because I want to try and change everyone's mind. If I'd done the arithmetic, I might have thought it differently, but anyway, so I would sit up at night, and there are these ferociously rude emails, and I'd sit up and say, well, thank you for your email, I gather you don't agree with me, but did you realise there's this and this, they're not illegal, almost all of them are genuine refugees, legally entitled to protection, blah, 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 all of this. And all of them replied. And every reply was polite. It was astonishing. And some of the replies sort of provoked a response from me, and others didn't. And at the end of it all, around about half of them ended up saying in substance, well, thank you for discussing it with me, I agree with you now. about 25% of men ended up in substance saying, thank you for discussing it with me, I don't agree with you, but I think it's good you stand up for what you believe in. And the other 25% of the people who now attack me on social media. The interesting thing about that was, it occurred to me, perhaps rather too late, that some of them, maybe many of them, weren't actually interested in the refugee issue. They felt detached from society and just wanted someone to listen to them. You know, you have people who start with a problem and they complain about it, and no one takes them seriously, either because their complaint is too bizarre, or if it's a legal problem, it's years or decades out of time and nothing can be done. Anyway, the less people listen, the louder they complain, and the louder they complain, the less people listen, and on it goes until they end up ringing late night talkback radio and eventually being filtered out by the panel operator. These are people who just need to be listened to. It's like spending 2 weeks without having eye contact with another person. So, I thought it was very interesting that those people said, that sort of made me realise that the problem for a lot of people is that they are so much at the margins that they fall off the map of humankind. They cease to be noticed by anyone, and that's a terrible thing. But then it became useful in a different way, because as people thought increasingly that I was some kind of free legal aid service, I got an increasing number of letters from people asking for help. And a lot of them were plainly people at the margins. So I would get letters like this. This is a woman who writes to me a lot, has been writing to me for a year or so. These 3 messages from this girl who lives somewhere up in the country, these 3 are from the last 2 days. I'm still being abused by the cruel and unusual method used by the meditator. This morning I awoke by a snapping inside my skull and could taste blood after I got up. This was due to the method the meditator uses to control and punish me for things. The things I do that warrant such treatment in the mediator's mind's eye are not clear to me. They are never explained or reasoned out. I'm very distressed, not being able to protect myself from the focus, concentration by the meditator, and the contempt, hatred and abuse. Now, anyone who writes that to someone they've never met is clearly very distressed. And then, just to back up what I said about concentration upon an object or person, I read in the book The World of Tibetan Buddhism that Tibetans do practice emptiness by concentrating upon the skull. Can't get more empty than a skull, I suppose. But the practice is, of course, not a literal emptiness, or maybe, I'm not certain. Other objects and people, I presume, from experience know and are also used. The fact is, it can be done. Another from a few days ago. The meditator is still hassling me frequently. The person is, quote, zombie-like in that they are obsessively focused upon me. I question whether they're having any of their own individual, independent existence beyond the concentration upon me. And she goes on to some personal details. And this is another one. Dear sir, this is not from the same girl. Dear sir, can you help me? I was born into a family with corrupt connection to the police and intelligence communities. One of these has just been convicted of murder. As I turned out to be cut from different cloth, and because I have unsolicited knowledge of their criminality since 1975, I've been subject to long-term surveillance and harassment because of my refusal to take a bribe or be a team player. I'm currently subject to long-term gang stalking, some of which I suspect is taxpayer funded. I've made complaints to the police over the years who do nothing. And then someone else. Dear Mr. Burnside, I sent the then Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott, proof that $7.8 million of taxpayers' money was given to 2 developers. He replied within a few days, telling me to give the information to Mr. Christopher Pyne. There's an active political bastardry if ever there was one. I did send full details to Mr. Pyne after several months and many emails asking him to respond. He eventually replied, telling me to go and speak to the highbrow thieves who gave taxpayers' money to 2 of their developer mates. Yes, me speak to them, I kid you not. I read that Mr. Brandis told Senator Bill Heffernan that, quote, no Australian was above the law. So I sent full details of the crime to Mr. Brandis, no reply. Full details were sent to our new PM, no reply. I then reported the crime to fraud@pmc.gov.au. A woman named was of course interested and asked me to send her full details, which I did. All of a sudden, the investigation stopped. Now I wonder who had enough clout to pull the plug. The arrogance of these overpaid, dishonest lot is mind-boggling. How dare they not respond to this disgraceful crime? Then someone else, I wish to bring to your attention matters involving serious, premeditated and systematic abuse of human rights by official entities in all Australian states and territories. Note that the issues are not confined to Australia. In fact, identical issues exist in the USA and Canada. I'd greatly appreciate any advice and assistance you can provide, given that several thousands of matters of which my group is aware are probably only the tip of the iceberg. We believe the services of a competent human rights barrister would assist us in restoring victim control of their lives and forcing procedural change that are desperately needed. Blah, blah, blah. And on he goes. This person, reporting an incident in October 2008. I was attacked at Sydney Airport by protective service officers for asking for a walking stick. I was hospitalised in the mental wing when they knew they hurt me physically and that I had physical problems, threatened with the anti-terror laws and put through 2 years of court so they could protect their lying asses as they clearly perjured themselves in order to pervert justice. After 2 years of hearings and obstruction by them, they lost and were ordered to pay my costs of near $40,000, but appealed, having to pay the costs on the grounds that they believed they could win, and the judge, whose name, decided their perjury and perversion of justice was perfectly acceptable to base for a conclusion that they could win and refused my costs, now $45,000. Blah, 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 pass over a few. Then he goes on, I don't know that all those several pages were continuation of the same email. I don't know what you can do for me, or if you are even willing to try, as I know I have no way of paying you unless you were to win for me. I am seeking compensation for what this has done to me. It seems the only way government departments will change policy is if it costs them. I've been a disabled pensioner since 1998 and also an ex-serviceman. Not that that is really relevant, except that I have a high degree of integrity and sense of right and wrong, and I believe I've been seriously wronged by this gross miscarriage of justice. And this person, my name is such and such. I'm from Iceland, but I'm living in Cambridge. I was wondering if you could help me. 2 devices were planted in my mouth a good few years ago. I've lost the 2 devices, but I've got camera evidence and I've still got a bit of the device in my gum to prove that they were in my mouth, and they are also using mind control, and they have cameras in my eyes because they see everything that I see, and I see the camera evidence on a nurse's phone in a mental home I've been getting tortured in for years, and on it goes, more of that. Now, obviously a number of these people have mental problems, but the things they complain of are as real to them as anything that happens to any of us. They are victims of terrible, terrible dissociation from reality, dissociation from the community. And that last one, he's in Cambridge for goodness sake, and he sends an email to an Australian barrister wanting help. Now, how marginalised do you have to be to have a problem like that? I mean, you go to a lawyer and the lawyer says, oh, it's not a legal problem, or if it's a legal problem, it's disappeared in the mists of time. You go to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, oh, look, it's really a problem relating to the fact that you're unemployed and you haven't got any money. These people have problems on all sorts of levels. Maybe a bit of a legal problem that led to a sense of injustice, coupled with unemployment, coupled with a mental problem, coupled with financial problems, and on it goes. These are truly people at the margins. What can we do? Well, most of us can't do very much for them, except we can recognise their existence. We can at least offer them that degree of human dignity of noticing that they exist, noticing that they've got a problem. The girl whose emails I started with, I write back to her after every couple of emails just to say, look, you know, it's awful that you're going through this and you have my sympathy, there's really not much I'm able to do. That seems to quieten her down a bit. It seems to satisfy her a bit that someone is listening. We all owe it to to every other member of our species to listen to them if they try and tell us what their problem is. If we see them as human beings, then we're providing some justice, at least, for people at the margins. And they're the ones who need it the most. In a country as lucky as Australia, it's very easy to think, everyone's okay, we all live well, we're all fine. But those of you in this room tonight who experienced the Holocaust or whose relatives experienced the Holocaust, you know that if any group is brushed off the edge of the map of humanity, their fate is terrible. And it should never be allowed to develop the way it did back then, and it will not, as long as all of us are conscientious about recognising that they too are human beings. They may be a pain in the neck, they may not have anything that you can fix, but they too are human beings, and you have to recognise that, or else there will never be justice at the margins. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Julian. You covered a lot of ground in that lecture, and so now we've got some time for questions, and hopefully it'll be questions rather than statements.
Everyone wants to be heard.
Yes, stand up.
How can just like everyday people, like who aren't like barristers like yourself, actually make such a big difference, for example, in human rights?
It's a good. Okay, the question was how can everyday people do something to help human rights? Is that a fair summary? Okay. You do what you can, and the starting point is recognising everyone as equally human. Recognising that everyone's humanity is equal to your own is the starting point. That way, you won't find people turning up at the Collins Street Baptist Church saying that they haven't had eye contact with another person for 2 weeks. It may not mean much, and yet it doesn't mean anything much for us, but for them, it means a great deal. The other thing is, I guess, I'm going to use your question as an opportunity to tell a story which really impressed me. I heard a story recently of a place where I had visited where there is a beach that every now and then gets a very big tide, and the big tide washes up lots of starfish. And if there's an onshore breeze when the tide goes down, the starfish are stranded on the sand. And if they stay there, the sun dries them out and they die. A little girl who lived near this beach was very distressed by it, and she went down to the beach, and a grown-up said to her, very sensibly, "You know you can't save all of them." Her response was to bend down, pick one up, throw it into the ocean, and said, "Well, I've saved that one." Okay? All of us can do something that's within our power which will make a difference. You can't solve the whole problem, but all of us can solve a bit of it. So that's how.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Alex.
We've all grown up in Australia remembering that we hardly ever saw any begging in Australia. Begging.
Yeah.
This has grown enormously in the last few years. By all economic accounts and so on, we're doing better and society is generally better. We know there's polarization, but generally, those people on the margin, how do you see the development that's created so much begging and so many people living on the streets?
I probably don't have the qualifications to be able to answer that properly. But people hear the question. There's an increase in the number of people on the streets begging. What can we do about that?
Well,
first of all,
what's created that?
check what notes are in your wallet before you pull it out. What causes people... Look, What about the rules regarding when Centrelink benefits are available seem to operate pretty harshly. If you lose a job and you're not able to get Centrelink benefits because you can't get through on the phone, you can't get Centrelink benefits until you're totally out of money, well, what do you do? There are asylum seekers living in the community now. Asylum seekers are only eligible for a discounted amount of Centrelink benefits, but if there's a case of a Rohingya man, Rohingyas are dead set, fair income refugees for sure. There's a Rohingya man living in Australia who, when he was working, was sending money to his wife and child who were stranded in Malaysia. And then he lost his job and he applied for social welfare, and the department said, no, you can't have it because you sent some money overseas some months back. Okay? It didn't mean that he wasn't hungry. He may, for all I know, be on the street begging. People only beg because they need the money. They're really debasing themselves in order to get something that is essential. And frankly, while I don't know why there's been an increase in the number of people begging, I do think that all of us who can should give them something. I don't care if they go and spend it on booze. If they need it, fine, let it be so. And I don't mind if some of them, some small percentage, turn out to be fake. Let it be so. But you can always save one starfish. You better ask your parliamentarians why numbers on the dole or what numbers in the street are increasing. But treat them seriously.
Thank you, Julian. You're amazing, an inspiration. I was made aware via a current affairs program that there's a lot of an increase in homelessness because there is some sort of organisation online that landlords can say that a particular tenant has not been a good tenant, and it could be quibbling over anything, or they just take a dislike to the tenant, and then that person, like when he goes or she goes to find another rental, their name is besmirched and they find it very difficult to get a rental. What can be done to stop this? Because I think this has led to a lot of homelessness, that people just can't get legitimate rental properties rented to them.
Okay, I don't know if everyone could hear that, but the thrust of it is that there is a sort of landlord's blacklist, so that if you have difficulty with your landlord, then you'll have real difficulty getting other premises to lease. Is that roughly it? What can you do? I would have thought that's something that only government can deal with, and would have to be state government, I think, because renting would be a state jurisdiction.
So it's a matter of getting in touch with state
Get in touch with parliamentarians. And by the way, when I say get in touch with parliamentarians, ring them or write to them. Do not email them. Emails will not be taken seriously. They're too easy to flick off. Write to them. If you're writing to them, if your handwriting is more legible than mine, write in handwriting. Keep it brief. No parliamentarian has the time to read a letter that's 2 or 3 pages long. Send them a brief letter, say, this is a real problem, what can you do about it? Try and engage them, ask them what are they going to do about it. Because it's clearly a problem. I wasn't aware of it until you raised it, but that is a serious problem. That's like having a bad credit rating, which is very difficult to escape. So yeah, bring it up and get all your friends to do the same thing. So they've got lots of complaints coming in.
You're all on notice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Julian, you made a powerful case tonight, as you have for so long, about the kind of evil of dehumanisation. We heard at the beginning how Bono would have dealt with the dehumanisers. How should we be dealing with dehumanisers, whether or not they're in government or elsewhere?
Or opposition. Don't vote for them, I suppose, is the answer. But at the risk of sounding political, I wouldn't want to encourage you to vote for One Nation either. I think the business with Manus recently has been interesting. You know, the public response to what is happening on Manus has picked up significantly, and I think that may lead to a shift in the politics. Maybe I'm too optimistic, maybe I need to be optimistic, but what are you going to do with them? Well, just don't vote for them. And let them know in advance that if they keep doing what they're doing, you're not going to vote for them. We're in a position of real political instability at the moment because of the Section 44 stuff. I think we will probably find ourselves with an election being called before Christmas, and if that happens, it's really unclear what's going to happen and who is going to be the leader of the then Labor government. So politicians are likely to be more interested in feedback at the moment. So if we live in a democracy, what can you do? Get on with the so-called leaders. And by the way, that may not be a very compelling answer, but I've been banging my head against a brick wall for 16 years trying to work out how we change things.
Yes, and then, okay.
Yeah, thank you, both you and Kate, for all the work that you do and the public voice you give refugees and marginalised people. I don't exactly know the question, how to phrase it, but you sort of mentioned about the Bill of Rights that we're lacking. Do you see hope for our country to develop a Bill of Rights, or how do we, or when would we get policy that would ensure there's more justice for the treatment of asylum seekers by voters?
As to the second question, all I can do is repeat what I just said. I don't know what the solution is going to be. I don't know if whether I'll ever see it in my lifetime, but starting point is for enough people in the community to think there's a problem that needs to be sorted out. That's difficult when the News Limited press continue to repeat government messages like illegal, queue jumpers and so on. As for a Bill of Rights, that's more difficult. The Labor Party, I think, have had it as part of their policy for a long time that there should be a federal Bill of Rights. They've had 5 runs at it and have failed or pulled back each time. I think they should be held to account and made to try it. Kevin Rudd, of course, called an inquiry that was led by Frank Brennan, and I know that Frank was not disposed in favour of the Bill of Rights initially, but ultimately recommended that we should have one, and then Rudd summarily dismissed that without explanation. Let me tell you, the best argument in favour of a Bill of Rights was given by John Howard, of all people. While Frank was running his inquiry, John Howard was doorstopped, and he was asked what he thought about a Bill of Rights, and he said, I think a Bill of Rights is a terrible idea because it gets in the way of what parliaments can do. That is precisely the point. That's precisely the point.
Okay, a question over here, was it? Yes.
I was going to ask a very similar question. I mean, Australia has contravened the rights of the child quite clearly, and I actually remember I worked with you way back when we did try and get children out of detention. There are still children in detention, and no one in this room, probably on this planet, would think that it's okay to have children in detention, yet Australia continues to have children in detention, and has also contravened the United Nations Human Rights Convention. I just wondered why you think that gets no traction, why the general man in the street thinks, and I know the Bill of Rights would obviously help that, but even in Victoria, where we actually have a human rights charter, we still have had no traction on what is clearly contravention of human and child rights.
First of all, the Victorian Charter of Human Rights can't be applied in relation to both people because that is a federal issue. And I think you can at least say to all the fearmongers that the Victorian Charter and the ACT equivalent have had no adverse effects. So that's why you start with a weak model, because you don't want to frighten the horses. I'm not sure what is the best way to achieve it. You're absolutely right about our breaches of various international conventions. And I was very interested to hear on the radio yesterday or the day before, who was that? It was a federal minister, might have been Steve Chobo or someone like that, who was arguing in relation to the marriage equality legislation, saying how you have to protect religious freedoms because that, after all, is protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Amazing to hear a member of the present federal government arguing that we have to behave in particular ways so as to conform to the ICCPR, which, as you point out, we breach all the time in our treatment of boat people. Unfortunately, we live in a sort of bubble, partly because of the News Limited influence, I think. And that was illustrated when Tony Abbott was still Prime Minister. I'm sorry for speaking obscenities, but Tony Abbott was still Prime Minister when the Special Rapporteur on Torture delivered a report in relation to 5 specific instances of treatment of people in Manus, and reported that in each of those instances Australia was in breach of its obligations under the Convention Against Torture. Now, I hope most people in the room will remember Tony Abbott's response. Australians are sick and tired of being lectured to by the UN. Now, that's an astounding thing for any Australian Prime Minister to say. But we live in a bubble. We're the only Western country that does not have coherent human rights protection in our laws, and it's a scandal. But there's an issue, going back to boat people specifically, children in detention and so on, there's a very interesting idea that I was told in Sydney on Friday, which is this, and I hope I'm not going to upset anyone by saying it. If you want to see the ethical, if you want to test the ethics of what we're doing to refugees, take any individual instance and say, if that person was a Jew fleeing Germany in the late 1930s, would you treat them that way? And I think the resounding answer is no, we would not. But there we are. We've debased ourselves as a society.
Julian, we've also seen, and maybe feels like precedent, some extreme forms of racism through some of these, I call the marginal right groups that become less marginal. We see One Nation, and One Nation could arguably win 20% of the vote next week in the Queensland election, which is terrifying. Do you see, successive governments trying to revisit 18C? Because I, as a citizen, don't fully understand the debate around 18C. Do you see the legal system or the government's trying to revisit that and either strengthen or weaken those particular objectives of 18C?
It's possible, although I suspect, look, regardless of the result in the Queensland election, 18C is a federal issue. I think the next election federally is going to see a Labor government come in, and I think they're not likely to change 18C. But if the debate starts, make sure and remind them it's not just 18C, it's 18C plus 18D. You cannot see one without the other. And 18D provides the sort of restraint on 18C which is necessary and rational, and by their history of the courts you can see that they work perfectly well.
Yes?
I'm really interested in your, what you were saying about marginalised people and the people who've been writing to you, and also the need to see everyone's humanity, and whether that can be applied to people who vote One Nation, people who voted for Brexit, to people who voted for Trump. And it's funny, but it's not funny, because it occurs to me that what we're hearing is it's the same plea that you're getting in your emails. It's them saying, I'm marginalised and no one's listening to me. And what can we do about that to stop our country from going further?
Well, listen to them, but don't vote for One Nation, I guess is the answer.
How do they feel listened to?
It depends on what they're saying, of course. I remember being at a lecture similar to this with Malcolm Fraser, and someone asked a question which was the sort of question you might expect someone from One Nation to ask, and Malcolm really gave them both barrels. It was very interesting. I think the person clearly felt as though they'd been listened to, but it wasn't a sort of calm, gentle response that they might have hoped for. The fact that you should listen to everyone does not mean that you have to approve of their views, but you can respond to their views without expressing approval. But then also maybe you need to dig below the surface just a little bit to see what is the origin of that toxic thinking. That's maybe the most constructive thing. It can take a bit of time, I can tell you from experience.
Just adding to that, could it also be that listening to those people's needs and also teaching them that their way of responding to it isn't going to ultimately be the best way to solve their problems of their needs, because often people that feel dispossessed, that they're being influenced by other people's ideas on what will help them that may not be the right thing for them, and letting them have more information on what can help other dispossessed people can ultimately help them too. But my question is, we talked a lot about the influence of media and the influence of the words of politicians, but there's a big percentage of the population that will never listen actually to the words of political leaders or read them, and don't listen to news shows or take an interest in that, but get a lot of their information from social media. And often the things on social media are so distorted, you know, that they'll show a demolished building on Manus Island or a pile of wood and say, look what these deranged, angry men have done. And people see it and believe it, or they'll write, these men have all said they're going to rape women when they come out. And straight away, hundreds of people are reading this and sharing it and believing these things. And isn't it a far greater danger that now that social media has that massive influence in people getting fears of unfounded things and not understanding situations?
I think President Trump would call that fake news, wouldn't he? And that is a problem. I agree, fake news is a problem. It has always been a problem because you can't rely on every vector of news distribution to be accurate and reliable. I think your proposition in theory is right, but in practice it may not account for more than a tiny percentage of people. And if people are communicating on social media, they're probably not at the margins. They're probably not, I mean, if they've got at least access to a computer, they're probably not marginalised in the same sense as the guy that Tim Costello spoke about. They're at the margins politically, perhaps, I hope. But I guess I would need to see a particular case in order to be able to respond.
There were two separate things. I just same minded that was on my head from her. Sorry.
Sorry, well, if I haven't answered your question properly, maybe we can talk offline.
Okay, just two more questions. Okay, Alex?
I just want to...
Legal studies teacher, so we have to be careful.
I just want to revisit what we've done in the past with the Bund and make a statement and not ask a question. So I think what we need to do is not to forget the benefits of our democratic society, and that is that we can have enormous influence by using our democratic rights, which is to contact our local members and to either see them face to face, make an appointment, go to their offices, write them letters and so on and so forth. It is still a very powerful thing to do. And the second thing is that most of these people actually do go into politics for the right reasons. And things like party lines and having to follow the party line can sometimes corrupt that. But I think ultimately there is that belief that they can change society and do something about it. And I think if we connect with them,
your take on why that message from the heart, the Indigenous message from the heart, that was, why was
You're
it
talking about the Uluru Statement?
the Uluru Statement, why you think it's been so summarily just dismissed? Has it just been put in the too hard basket, or is it just there's so many other issues that it's just too? It seemed to me a terrible rejection of something that was so from the heart. But there's got to be. Is it that there's no political will? What do you think?
Well, I suspect that there's no political will to do something which is actually constructive. We're offering lip service. We're offering to acknowledge their existence in the Constitution. Well, whoopee-doo. And frankly, you know, the standard recognition of the, you know, elders of the lands and the traditional owners, all of that stuff that you hear at every public meeting, it's lip service. We're perfectly content to say words that sound nice, as long as they don't involve us in changing our position at all. And I suspect that that's what explains the dismissal of the Uluru Statement. Yeah, it's a very bad bit of our history, but then it's a bad history.
Okay, I think we'll conclude now. Thank you very much. The discussion could go on for a long time and will go on in various forms. Thank you, Julian. Just want to say something that bothers me a lot, having been involved in the issues that Julian was talking about for many, many years. Very often I'm asked questions, and I'm asked questions at school, especially at school, and it's sad to see this sort of pessimism creep in, you know. No matter what we do, nothing happens, you know. And it's not true. It's actually not true. And despair is not an option. Despair is what the people of Manus are feeling. Despair is what many marginalised people are feeling. You know, we don't have that despair. And I don't think despair is an option. And the Starfish story, I think that is the heart of the matter. And I do think that the fact there have been many people fighting this dehumanisation in all kinds of ways, and through the law, as Julian has, and also Julian is one of those that keeps telling the stories. If you keep telling the stories, also you are fighting that dehumanisation. And I think there has always been a struggle for human rights. Always. Every generation experiences it anew and will always experience it anew. And it's one of the reasons, Julian, I'm so proud of being a member of the Bund and the Skiff. The youth movement in particular is constantly involved in these discussions and crossing cultural boundaries. And I think that this is the way it's always been, and this is what we always face. And I think things can change and have changed. I think there have been many people whose lives have been changed because of the actions of human rights advocates, but also because of the actions of people who take their own destiny in their own hands, as the men on Manus have, and take a stand and demand that we listen when they take that stand. Last night I went and I saw one of the most extraordinary performances I've ever seen in my life. It left me weeping. It left many people weeping. And this was a show called Nanette, performed by Hannah Gadsby. And, you know, it sums up everything that Julian has been talking about. Hannah Gadsby last night stood on a stage in a packed-out theatre, in the Playbox Theatre in the city, and she said, "Look, I'm a comedian, but I can't laugh anymore. I'm angry. I've got to tell you, I'm angry. A year ago, I read a text as I was landing in London, and the text just said, you know, there's going to be a plebiscite, and then all the vitriol started happening. And the thing that came up again and again and again was the statement, but what about children? What about having children? You know, the children. And she kept on saying, I am a children. I am a children. And then she told a story that was so devastating that it broke people's hearts in that audience. And she had the courage to tell that story. And she said that I internalised, as a child, the fact that I'm worth nothing. And the comedy has helped to a certain extent, but now I have to continue rebuilding my life in other ways. And the examples she gave of how she reached that state were utterly devastating. What had happened to her growing up in Tasmania when it was still illegal to be homosexual until the late 1990s. But as she stood there, I thought, here is a fighter for human rights. And in her own presence and her storytelling was answering the question of dehumanisation by standing up and saying, here I am, this is my voice and hear me. And I think in thanking Julian, we're talking about someone who's been listening for many years now, not only listening, but putting his money where his mouth is and defending people pro bono. And I highly recommend this book, Watching Out. An interesting sidelight here, Julian, is that Henry Rosenblum, whose company Scribe published it, comes from a Bund family, so you're surrounded by Bundists. And Henry has been Scribe has been publishing Julian's books. And I think what's wonderful about this book is that it ranges so far and wide, and it has got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's got many points of reference which can be very useful in a practical sense for people that want to get involved at a deeper level of human rights issues. Now, the book is not available here, but we're going to take down names with email addresses so that it can be purchased and posted to you free of postage charge. So as you leave, you can avail yourself of that possibility. But I wanted to end. With the way the book ends, right? And I think this sums up so much of what we've been discussing today. And Julian ends like this. If we care about justice, we need to fix our political system. In the past, the acid test of a political policy was, is it right? These days, the test is, will it sell? That becomes, will it attract the support of the tabloid press? But that does not produce democracy. It produces mob rule. And where the mob rules, individuals will suffer and justice will perish. Injustices that are avoidable but tolerated are like canaries in the mine. They are a warning of worse things to come. For those of us who do not live at the margins, it is useful to recall the famous observation of Martin Niemöller during a lecture after World War II. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So I think that sums up the wonderful work that Julian's been doing and sums up why we're here. Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you very much for coming.